Number 10, the snailfish. In 2023, researchers aboard the DSSV pressure drop lowered a camera to the deepest point of the Mariana Trench, nearly 7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The pressure down there is more than 1,000 times greater than what you feel standing on a beach. It should be a dead zone, lifeless, cold, and absolute. The camera touched bottom, the lights came on, and the scientists watching the live feed went completely still. A small pale fish drifted into frame, unhurried, unbothered, swimming deeper than any fish had ever been recorded in history. It froze them. Not the fish, the researchers. They stared at the screen and nobody spoke. It was a snailfish, a juvenile, no longer than a pencil, and it had no business being there. At that depth, the pressure alone should have crushed the proteins inside its cells, breaking down the tiny biological machinery that keeps any living thing alive, just quietly taking it apart from the inside. Yet there it was, calm, pale, and perfectly intact. Scientists later confirmed the record. The fish showed no distress, no struggling, no erratic movement, just a creature going about its existence at the bottom of the world, as if the bottom of the world were the most natural place to be. Some researchers believe the snailfish carry a special chemical inside their cells that acts like armor against the pressure, stabilizing everything that should collapse. Others admit they don't fully understand it yet, that a fish, an animal with bones and organs not entirely unlike our own, can live where a human would be destroyed in seconds. That part has no clean answer. One researcher on the expedition later said it felt less like a scientific discovery and more like a glimpse through a keyhole into a world that had been living perfectly well without us. The trench had kept that fish secret for longer than our species has existed. Whatever else is down there, still unseen and unnamed, it isn't waiting for our permission. Number 9, the bioluminescent storms. During deep diving expeditions conducted between 2018 and 2022, scientists descended through the dark water above the trench and watched something happen that none of them had predicted. The darkness began to pulse. Cold blue and green light erupted around them. Not from a single creature, not from a small cluster, from everywhere at once. Hundreds of animals, spread across a huge stretch of water, flashing at the same time in cascading waves, one triggering the next, rolling outward through the black in patterns that looked far too organized to be accidental. The researchers pressed closer to the viewport. Nobody reached for their notes. Single creatures producing light in the deep ocean is well documented. Certain fish, jellyfish, some squid. That part isn't the mystery. The mystery was that they all did it together. The light moved through the water in one direction, building and spreading, in a way that didn't match hundreds of animals reacting independently. One scientist on the team described it as watching a conversation she couldn't translate. Researchers proposed explanations, a chain reaction of startled animals, mating signals bouncing through a dense crowd, sensitivity to tremors from deep below. None of them fully explained the patterns. None of them explained the direction, the timing, the sense of something being passed from one creature to the next across a vast stretch of darkness. The footage is still being studied. What the researchers agree on is simpler and stranger than any single theory. The water above the Mariana Trench is not empty or passive. It is active, layered, and running on rules that science has only just begun to find. Whatever those lights were saying to each other, they had been saying it long before anyone arrived to notice. Number 8, the scaly-foot gastropod. In 2010, during a major international ocean survey, scientists pulled a creature from the sediment near heat vents at the trench's edge that immediately divided the room. It was a snail, roughly the size of a thumbnail. Its shell was coated in scales made of iron, pulled directly from the volcanic material around the vents, and built into the animal's own body in a way nobody had ever seen before in any living thing. The team stood around the sample and looked at it, then at each other, then at it again. But the shell wasn't what stopped them. It was the hair. Thin filaments covered the snail's foot, growing outward in every direction, dense and even, doing nothing that anyone could identify. They weren't for movement. They weren't sense organs in any way science recognized. They were just there, arranged too neatly to feel random, with no explanation anyone could agree on. Lab work confirmed the iron shell was real armor. The animal had evolved to wear the geology of its environment as a coat. The filaments stayed unresolved for years. Some scientists suggested they might interact with the magnetic fields near the vents. Others thought they were leftovers from an ancestor that lived somewhere completely different. A third group wrote them down in the data and said nothing. The scaly-foot gastropod is now listed as endangered. Its entire known population lives within a few small vent fields, an area smaller than a city block, at the bottom of the deepest ocean on Earth. It wears iron. It grows hair nobody can explain. It lives in conditions that should make it impossible. And somewhere down there, in the dark and the heat and the crushing weight, it is almost certainly doing something we haven't filmed yet. Number 7. The amphipod swarms. In 1995, Japanese researchers lowered an unmanned lander into the Mariana Trench as part of a deep-sea project that marked the first time any vehicle had reached the very bottom since 1960. The lander carried bait and cameras. Within minutes of touching the seafloor, the bait was gone, not slowly picked at, not partially eaten, gone. And surrounding the lander in every direction, visible at the edges of the lights, were amphipods. Thousands of them. Small shrimp-like creatures moving fast, coordinated, and completely silent in the way that only things in absolute darkness can be. The researchers watching the footage sat very still and did not speak for a long time. Scientists had known these creatures existed down there. What they hadn't known was the scale, the density, the speed. The deeper you go in the Mariana Trench, the more of them there are, which is the opposite of what anyone predicted. Ecosystems get thinner as food gets scarcer. The deepest zone should be nearly empty. Instead, it is, in certain very measurable ways, crowded. Researchers now believe the shape of the trench acts like a funnel, pulling dead organic material downward and concentrating it at the very bottom. And these creatures evolved over millions of years to exploit exactly that. One scientist described it as discovering the basement of the ocean had better food than the floors above it. But what stayed with the team wasn't the theory. It was the footage, the speed, the coordination. Thousands of creatures responding to a single event in near-perfect unison, 7 miles below the surface, in a place where light had never existed, until that lander arrived and switched its lights on. They swarmed, consumed everything completely, and receded back into the dark. The trench had been doing that in perfect silence, long before anyone thought to look. Number 6. The bloop. In 1997, underwater microphones positioned across the Pacific Ocean picked up a sound of enormous power. It was detected by sensors thousands of miles apart, which meant whatever made it had to be extraordinarily loud, louder than almost anything ever recorded in the ocean. The sound lasted about a minute. It rose in pitch, sharp and building, and then it stopped. And scientists traced it to a point in the South Pacific near the edge of the Mariana system. They named it the bloop, and then they sat with it for 15 years. Imagine sitting in a quiet monitoring room, watching sound graphs scroll across a screen, and seeing a signal appear that dwarfs nearly every other recorded sound in ocean history, rising, building, and then simply ending. Scientists eventually decided in 2012 that it was most likely a massive crack in Antarctic ice, sending sound waves thousands of miles through the deep ocean. Most researchers accepted that. Some did not. The ice explanation accounts for the power and the distance. It does not fully account for the way the sound rose in pitch, which is more typical of a living thing than a geological event. The scientists who first processed the recording noted quietly in their internal files that the pattern didn't match any ice event they had seen before. The ocean beneath the Mariana Trench carries sound in ways the surface world doesn't. Farther, deeper, stranger. And occasionally it sends something upward that nobody on the surface was ready to hear. The bloop was recorded once. It has never come again. Whatever made it has not repeated itself. Or it has. And we were simply listening in the wrong direction. Number 5. The plastic. In 2018, a research team from Newcastle University studied small, shrimp-like creatures collected from the Mariana Trench at depths between 4 and 7 miles down. Inside every single one, they found plastic, fragments of plastic bags, fibers from synthetic clothing, particles from single-use bottles. The concentrations in some samples were higher than those found in some of the most polluted coastal waters on Earth. The team looked at the data and looked at it again. The most remote, most isolated, most physically unreachable place on the planet was already full of what we had thrown away. It had been that way for years before anyone thought to check. The mechanism is the same one that concentrates the amphipod food. The shape of the trench pulls everything downward. Plastic particles sink, settle into the sediment, and get eaten by the creatures that live at the bottom. From there, they move up through every animal that feeds on those creatures. The team's lead researcher said plainly that there was no untouched deep ocean left. There never would be again. The trench is 7 miles deep and billions of years old, dark, cold, and absolute in every way that matters. It took less than a century of human activity to reach it without ever meaning to. Every other entry in this countdown is about the trench producing something unexpected, something alive, something strange, something that rewrites a rule. This one is different. This one is about what we sent down without knowing, without stopping. The trench kept its secrets for billions of years. We left something in it that will outlast everything we have ever built, in a place we have barely seen, in water no human hand has ever touched. Number 4. The giant single cells. In 2011, a research team lowered cameras into the Mariana Trench at nearly 7 miles deep and photographed something that quietly forced science to rewrite what it thought it knew about how small a living cell has to be. Scattered across the seafloor in large numbers were creatures called xenophyophores. The name doesn't matter as much as what they are. Each one is a single cell, not a cluster of cells working together, not a colony, one cell, individually alive. And some of them were bigger than a human fist. A single living cell with no brain, no eyes, no nervous system of any kind, larger than something you could hold in your hand, living in complete darkness, under pressure that would crush a submarine, in water just above freezing. The lead researcher later said finding them in those numbers felt like discovering that the rules everyone else followed simply did not apply down there. She said it quietly, like something that still unsettled her after the fact. These creatures had been found in other parts of the deep ocean before. What was new was how many there were in the trench, and how large. The deeper the location, the bigger they grew, which is again the opposite of what science predicted. In places with little food and crushing pressure, living things are supposed to shrink down and become efficient. These went the other direction entirely. Researchers think their size might actually protect them. More internal fluid relative to their surface, meaning the pressure has less leverage against them. The idea is reasonable. It is also unproven. No experiment has fully confirmed it. What remains is the image. A seafloor carpeted in enormous single cells, ancient beyond any useful measure, alien in every way that biology usually isn't, thriving in conditions that should have made them a complete impossibility. They have no brain, no nervous system, no coordinated structure of any kind. They are as simple as life gets, and they are enormous and numerous and completely unbothered by a place that would kill almost everything else on Earth. The trench floor belongs to them. It has for longer than complex life has existed anywhere on the surface of this planet. Number 3, the sounds from the bottom. During the 2022 expedition that set the depth record for fish observation, the research team lowered sound recording equipment alongside their cameras into the deep. What those instruments captured became the subject of a scientific paper that drew attention far outside the usual circles. The snailfish, the same tiny pale creatures photographed breaking the depth record, were making sounds. Not random noise from moving through water, not accidental, structured signals. 4 distinct types recorded across multiple dives. A short, regular pulse, a longer, steady tone, a rapid series of clicks, and a low, rumbling sound the researchers described as unlike anything ever documented in fish at any depth. The team listened to the playback in a quiet lab, and nobody said anything for a moment. Fish using sound to communicate is known in many species near the surface. They do it for mating, for territory, for warning each other about danger. What nobody knew was that a fish living at the absolute bottom of the world's deepest trench, in a place long assumed too extreme for anything beyond basic survival, was doing it too. The calls were consistent enough across recordings to suggest they weren't random. They had pattern, repetition, and what the paper carefully called the characteristics of a possible communication system. One member of the research team, speaking to a journalist after the paper came out, said the recordings felt deeply strange to listen to. Not frightening, not beautiful exactly, just utterly, quietly purposeful. As if something down there had things to say, had always had things to say, and had been saying them for a very long time in the dark, to an audience that had only just arrived with the equipment to hear. Number 2, the microbes that shouldn't be that active. In 2014, researchers from a leading ocean science institution drilled into the sediment at the very bottom of Challenger Deep and brought cores of it back to the surface for analysis. The results took months to process and longer to agree on. Inside the sediment, they found microbes, microscopic living things, in extraordinary numbers and variety. That alone wasn't the surprise. The surprise was what those microbes were doing. They were active, not barely alive in the way things in extreme environments often are, running at minimum just to hold on, active, breaking down carbon, cycling nitrogen, producing and consuming gases at rates the team described as far higher than the available food in that environment should have allowed. They were doing more work than the math said was possible. The lead researcher read the figures 3 times before she called anyone else into the room. Several explanations were put forward. Unknown energy sources hidden in the sediment, biological processes science hadn't characterized yet, contamination during sampling, Though the team's methods were reviewed and found solid, the published paper used careful, measured language, the kind scientists reach for when the data is real and the explanation isn't ready. But in a recorded interview 2 years later, the lead researcher said something that didn't make it into the paper. She said that when she first saw the figures come back from the lab, her first thought wasn't a scientific hypothesis. It was simpler than that. She thought, something down there is thriving, not surviving, thriving. In the oldest, darkest, most crushed sediment on the floor of the deepest place on Earth, something was not enduring its circumstances. It was flourishing in them, and the age of the sediment suggested it had been doing so for longer than human civilization has existed in any form. Number 1, the thing in the water that had no name. In 2021, a team of researchers from multiple countries conducted a full survey of the water column above Challenger Deep, measuring temperature, salt levels, oxygen content, and the amount of floating material at every depth. At a specific layer between roughly 3.5 and 4.5 miles down, every single instrument registered something unusual at the same time. The temperature was slightly warmer than it should have been. The floating material suggested living organic matter in concentrations that didn't match the water above or below. The oxygen dipped in a pattern consistent with something consuming it. Small deviations, consistent ones, across every instrument, at every position, simultaneously. The team ran the numbers again. The numbers said the same thing. Taken one at a time, each reading had a possible explanation. Geological activity, unusual water layering, instrument sensitivity at extreme depth. Taken together, all of them at once. In the same place, at the same time, they pointed at something the team was reluctant to put into print. The lead researcher, someone with 30 years of deep ocean work behind her, described the zone in the published paper as an area of elevated biological and chemical complexity requiring further study. In an internal document written for the team and later referenced in a funding proposal, she used different language. She wrote that the zone felt, and she acknowledged the word was not scientific, inhabited, not in the sense of fish or shrimp-like creatures, which were logged separately, inhabited in the sense that something was processing the water, changing it, using it in a way that left a mark on every instrument pointed at it. No follow-up expedition has returned to that depth with the tools needed to identify what was detected. The data sits in the published record, noted carefully, cited occasionally, and unresolved. The Mariana Trench descends nearly 7 miles into the Earth. Humanity has explored a fraction of its full volume, and somewhere in the dark water above its floor, at a depth no human has ever visited in person, something left a mark on every instrument pointed at it. And then the ships went home, and the trench returned to silence. And whatever was down there went on doing what it had always done, unchanged, unhurried, and entirely unconcerned with whether we understood it or not.